Okay, hello everybody. It's just past 6 o'clock, so I'm going to get us started so we don't keep you too long. So good evening and thank you for joining us. My name is Andrea Linton. I'm the head for the Bureau of Public Outreach in the DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation. And I just want to welcome everyone here tonight. And I wanted to note that this webinar is being recorded and we'll make this available online after the captions are translated into Spanish. Joining us tonight are our presenters. We have the Department of Environmental Conservation Commissioner Basil Sagos, Department of State Secretary Robert Rodriguez, and the DEC Chief Resiliency Officer Susanna Randall. So thank you for joining us. We also have representatives of New York State agencies who are involved in the implementation of the Clean Water, Clean Air, and Green Jobs Environmental Bond Act, and they will be answering questions and collecting your comments throughout the session. To ask a question or to submit a comment, please click on the Q&A button, which you'll see in the tray at the bottom of your screen. That's the icon that's circled on your screen right now, and you can type questions and comments in the Q&A window. You'll also be able to see written responses that are entered in from participants throughout the webinar. Participants are welcome to submit questions and comments as we go, and we will be responding with written answers throughout the session. We'll also pause during the presentation to address some questions verbally, and we will also dedicate some time after the presentation for Q&A as well. You'll hear a bit later in the program about an online Bond Act survey where you can submit your project ideas in more detail and provide feedback, and we will make the link for that survey available in the chat. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can, but we may not be able to address all of them here tonight because we do have 384 registered attendees, and currently almost 150 people have joined, so we may get a lot of questions. Please note that there will be an FAQ available on the New York State Bond Act website, and we will use your questions and feedback to update the FAQs as we go forward, so keep that in mind. In addition, there is a chat window which can be used to alert the presenters to any technical issues, so that's something else you'll see at the bottom of your screen. For any other questions and comments, please use the Q&A window, however. Finally, there is a closed captions button in the tray, and participants can click on this to enable automated closed captions in English. To adjust your caption settings, including caption size and which actions are captioned, you can click on the arrow next to the closed caption icon, and it will open the settings menu. A Spanish language translation of tonight's webinar will also be made available online, along with the English language recording at a later date. So thanks again for joining, and I will now turn it over to Commissioner Basil Sagos.
Excellent. Hi, everybody. Andrea, thanks for the very nice intro there. Hats off to Andrea and all the people behind the scenes right now. Really an incredible undertaking across all of state government to bring this incredible Bond Act to the people of New York. So thank you, Andrea. Excited to be here tonight, certainly with Secretary of State Rodriguez and Susanna Randall, who you'll get a chance to meet in a second. Again, part of that great team. Believe all of you know what the Bond Act is, an extraordinary moment in the history of environmental protection here in New York. Last year, the voters coming together and saying yes at nearly 70% that it is worth the state's investment of $4.2 billion in our environment. It's worth pursuing with the public and stakeholders all across the state an undertaking to begin protecting the state from the effects of climate change, from severe weather, and making the state more sustainable over time. So certainly an amazing moment in time. There's not often that, first of all, that there's consensus on anything, and certainly not often that we get the public to weigh in on environmental legislation in this way that gets us across the finish line in such a big way. So this is the third meeting. Next slide, please. This is the third meeting. We started in Buffalo with the governor a few weeks ago, and then down in Cortland about a week and a half after that. We'll get through the meat of the conversation today between the secretary and I. But I think you see the agenda in front of you right now. We'll talk about the priorities and how the Bond Act came about, what the priorities are of the Bond Act, Of course, a range of priorities. I mentioned a few of them and some that I did not mention yet that we'll get into, including disadvantaged communities and the legacy of pollution across New York State. We're going to talk about the main funding categories and give project examples. Again, we're coming to you with some broad strokes, some broad brushes that are reflective of the language of the Bond Act. But a lot of this is to get you thinking about projects that we could begin looking at around the state. We want to fund the best projects and chase the best ideas. Some of those categories include investments in public schools, right? Green buses, electric buses, clean green schools, clean water to drink, as well as critical water infrastructure around the state, vital environmental habitats, flood risk, as I mentioned, protecting outdoor spaces, including farms, and of course, adapting and mitigating the impacts of climate change. So let me move to introduce Susanna Randall. We're so lucky to have Susanna on board. Susanna is literally in her first, I think, 7 days as DEC's first ever Chief Resiliency Officer. Susanna came to us with great familiarity with DEC and with the state of New York. Currently was most currently the Deputy Director of Project Delivery with the Office of Homes and Communities, which is, as everyone knows, HCR, as well as GOZER, Governor's Office of Storm Recovery, where she oversaw more than 150 storm recovery projects statewide. And before that, she was with the Environmental Facilities Corporation in Albany, focusing on green infrastructure around the state. Susanna is going to be a great part of the team. She's got great diplomatic skills to navigate through all the layers of government and all the various stakeholder groups that are out there. I want to give her a chance to say hello and say some words. Susanna.
Great, thanks. I'm thrilled to be here to join DEC and lead the Bond Act office. And I look forward to hearing all the questions and comments that we get tonight and in our future listening sessions, because really your ideas, your questions, your feedback are instrumental in helping us shape clear, transparent programs that support projects to help communities across the state meet our environmental needs and really make our communities more resilient. So I'll turn it right back over to you. I'm excited to hear from all the people we have online.
Excellent. Thanks, Susanna. And yeah, tonight you're hearing from DEC and the Department of State. But just to reiterate that this is really a whole of government approach to this. I mean, DOT, HCR, Homes, Community Renewal, you name it. Parks, of course, we are all invested in the Bond Act and all part of this team statewide to bring this incredible law to fruition. So what is the Bond Act? I covered that certainly. I mentioned the 4 categories. I think what is important to understand is what is bondable and what is not bondable. To be funded by the Bond Act, the project itself must have a useful life of 10 years. Such things as operations and maintenance, food and lodging, equipment, furniture, all the various related items. Those kinds of things are not bondable. So as you begin, coming up with your projects and submitting project ideas to us, please keep those things in mind. I mean, of course, our intent with this is to leverage Bond Act dollars, go beyond just the Bond Act of $4.2 billion, leverage federal funds, private funds, nonprofit funds, make this certainly go farther than the $4.2 billion. Just keep that in mind about what is bondable and what is not. Next slide, please. So eligibility guidelines. You can imagine the law itself was somewhat specific about what projects are eligible, which are not. We are in the midst of coming up with very specific guidelines. The various state agencies are drafting those right now. All of those will be released before any of the pots are made available. We want to actually, of course, go back to the public and hear from the public specifically on the guidelines for each of the buckets that we'll be talking through tonight. So please keep your eyes out for that. We will be coming back to you very specifically about the kinds of feedback we need to get from you. Next slide, please. Mentioned Bond Act priorities, right? This really goes to the heart of the Bond Act, and of course, what the legislature and the governor were able to agree upon, but also some of the emphasis that we've been able to put on as agencies. Of course, updating infrastructure. No secret, we have in some cases deteriorating infrastructure that's decades, if not hundreds of years old, that we need to focus on in light of changing environmental conditions, climate change, severe weather, and so forth. Protecting natural resources, right? A state or an entity that protects its natural resources has a much more sustainable economy in the long run. So that's certainly a focus of ours right now. Advancing environmental justice, and I'll talk about that in a second, but of course, a core principle of everything that we're doing at DEC and amongst all the various state agencies, and creating jobs. Next slide, please. So I mentioned environmental justice. Now, it is no secret that many communities around the state have not, while we've made great progress on environmental pollution over the years, there are many communities that have not sustained that level of improvement. These are the communities that also bore the brunt of pollution for many years. Now, the Bond Act and the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which is the state's climate law, have some very nice overlap in many ways. The CLCPA, the Climate Act, envisions that we won't just be reducing our emissions and creating green jobs across the state, but we'll specifically invest the proceeds of our efforts to the tune of 35% in environmental justice communities, with a goal of 40%. That's a goal that shows up specifically in the language of the state's climate law. We're extending it into the Bond Act, and we're extending it beyond just the Bond Act into water spending for that matter. So this is a chance for us to really, as we make the state more sustainable and greener, that we're ensuring that every community in New York State is lifted up. Next slide, please. So you saw environmental justice, those words on the last page. Now we're talking about what a disadvantaged community is. Disadvantaged communities in New York are effectively environmental justice communities, but the law itself required us to develop maps all across the state using specific data to assess which communities were disadvantaged. And that then helps us to direct our funding in a way that then helps us meet those targets, the 35% minimum investment, 40% target investment. So you see the statewide map here, and that gives you a sense really where the disadvantaged communities are all across the state, those communities in blue. It's about 35% of the census tracts in New York, which is a substantial number of New Yorkers. Once you break down the numbers, it's almost half the population of New York. The indicators we used on this to develop the maps was about 45 indicators. And ultimately, this was done in a very scientific process through public comment, a range of meetings over 3 years, and using the input of the Climate Justice Working Group, which met on a regular basis. These were appointees to state agencies, which then developed this work in conjunction with state leaders. Next slide, please. So this is just to give you an example of what these maps look like at a more micro level. That call out box there, that's the city of Watertown. That's the North Country. You can see how based on those 45 indicators and based on the data that we're able to generate, the outlines of based on census tracts, the outlines of Watertown, almost entirely, the north side of Watertown, almost entirely a disadvantaged community. You also see places like Messina and parts of Plattsburgh, and some very rural areas that are also picked up in that. Next slide, please. And this is the Finger Lakes, Rochester area. You can see when we really get down to the nitty gritty in the neighborhoods there, how the census tracts are smaller, and yet we're picking up most of the census tracts within the city of Rochester. But then, of course, if you look then across to the west and the east in the Finger Lakes area, you're picking up large sections of some of these counties that are very rural in nature. So you get a sense how the Bond Act proceeds in this to meet these priorities will actually be spent not just in urban areas, but of course, very much so in rural areas. Next slide, please. And of course, New York City. We have a huge number of communities in the city, and you look at the Bronx, look at parts of Queens and Brooklyn, of course, the north side of Staten Island, where you have a number of communities, again, based on science, based on data, that qualify for disadvantaged communities criteria. Next slide. And then I'll turn it over to Andrea. I mentioned jobs in the beginning, and I mentioned the $4.2 billion. Again, we estimate that the Bond Act, $4.2 billion, will actually deliver $8.71 billion in project spending. That's a huge number. And you look at the jobs created, 84,000 jobs. And I think in large part, that's why New Yorkers were willing to say yes to this investment. I mean, this is an investment that is going to pay dividends for New Yorkers, period. And of course, making the state more resilient and more able to withstand the effects of our changing environment. We also succeeded in putting very important labor provisions into the Bond Act, securing good paying jobs, right? Our brothers and sisters in labor, being able to help chart the path forward for many of the important projects that we are going to undertake in conjunction with the public. So you note some of the bullets there: prevailing wages for Bond Act projects, that's a requirement, apprenticeship agreements for these large projects, and then Buy America provisions to the greatest extent possible. So again, really exciting. You can see that this is big and bold. I've blown through a lot of it at a very high level. Maybe we'll pause for some basic questions. Andrea, if you're seeing anything in there that we can address before we head to Secretary Rodriguez for some of the amazing color of the Bond Act.
Yes, we are getting a few questions, so thanks,
Okay.
everybody. So I'll start with a few of them now, and some of them did kind of relate to some of the topic that we're going to talk about for the second half of the presentation, but I'll go through a few of them now. So there was one question from Catherine Murphy, was actually asking about if any of the, well, not Bond Act money per se, but was asking about DEC hiring more conservation officers to enforce the environmental laws. And specifically talking about in Region 3, where she said she's reported some issues and that they haven't necessarily been followed up on. So I'm not quite sure who might answer that one. Possibly Jim Tierney or someone from exec.
Maybe I can take that.
Okay.
We are on a robust hiring process right now for our next academy. We, unlike most of the employees at DEC, we have to go through a process to create the police academy, which is it takes about a year to stand up. So we're in the process of hiring for the next academy, and of course, once that academy begins, it's a 6-month process, and then they come out as environmental conservation officers. So proud to have had, I think, 4 academies, maybe 5 academies in my tenure at DEC, and we are looking forward to the next one as soon as we can have that. And as to the specific questions on Region 3, any concerns that haven't been addressed, happy to raise those offline. If you can put your contact information in the chat, we'll have somebody follow up with you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I do believe after you registered, we do have your info, so we can definitely follow up on that question. So thank you. Then there was another question from Dennis Derrick, and it was related to disadvantaged communities. So I think this may be a question for Alana Cadell-Tucky. I know she's very familiar with this whole process. It was a comment saying that it's very difficult to translate the disadvantaged communities info when going from zip code to census tract. And we did put in the chat, if you didn't see it, there is a link to one of the DEC websites that has more information about the disadvantaged communities layer and how we came up with those details. So I didn't know if Alana or someone else may be able to give some more details on that.
Hi, Andrea, it's Alana. Well, there really aren't a whole lot of extra details. I will say that we are working on creating a way for folks to be able to search a little bit easier using zip code data and maybe grouping certain zip codes within census tracts. It's just that for a lot of what we consider to be, or what some folks consider to be communities, doesn't always translate with regards to census tract data. Census tract data is usually about 8,000 households, so it doesn't always spread as evenly when it comes to where specific zip codes are located. So we are working on trying to find a way to make that easier and more user-friendly for folks. So stay tuned.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Donna Harris. This was related to the previous question and the answer on that. How can people access the new jobs? Are jobs equitably distributed across the state? So that may be a Commissioner Sago's question.
Yeah, why don't I try that? And if anyone else wants to weigh in, that's great also. So yes, I mean, the projects will be statewide. We're imagining that every county in New York State is going to have a large number of these projects, and of course, local hiring is always preferred if that's possible. So I would say look for the increase in opportunities as these projects get underway. We did in the budget this year, in the state budget agreed to by the governor and the legislature, several of the agencies on this call, including Parks and DEC, did get increases, staffing increases, not huge, but increases that are enabling us to actually carry out the Bond Act. So if your question is about employment with the state, please check back with our websites, of course, all the hiring process, the hiring availabilities that you see on LinkedIn and everything else, to see where there might be opportunities with New York State.
Okay, thank you. And to keep things moving, I'll read one more question out for now, and then we'll continue on. And we do have several additional questions that we will read once we get to the next pause or to the end. So this is a question from Dr. Charmaine Cohen, and it's a question kind of related to DAX, but also to green jobs. Can you at this point describe the type of green jobs that will be available? What will be the criteria for jobs, education, or certifications? And how will they be promoted or announced in the disadvantaged communities, specifically in the Rochester area? So there's a lot in there, I know, lots of good stuff. So I didn't know if Alana or
That one for me. Yeah, I just
or
sure,
perhaps
that one's for me.
Wheeleen from Labor, if you had Wheeleen Chick had any questions or responses on the jobs part of it. But if you have some thoughts, Alana, feel free to chime in first.
I'm sure. I would just say that at this point, we are still trying to develop a lot of these. So we don't have direct answers right now about what a lot of this is going to look like. We are dealing with a very new sort of groundbreaking way of looking at overburdened communities and how to make sure that we're directing funding to these areas. And how we're making sure to look at all of this through a very holistic approach, looking at investments, looking at job creation and economics, as well as climate change burdens and environmental burdens. So we will be coming out with a little bit more detailed information as this moves forward. So again, as I said before, stay tuned. But right now, I don't think that we have anything direct that we can share at this point.
Yeah, and I would just add that those green jobs would, necessarily be tied to the projects, and the type of projects that would be available would then become available with the information on, how that's a green job. But also just with respect to, and maybe even going back to the other question, DOL does have information on registered apprenticeship programs that is on their website. And for those projects that would have the apprenticeship program, you can actually go on DOL and find the list of current sponsors that would be available and kind of go through that avenue as well. And I do think that apprenticeship programs, registered apprenticeship programs are, key to bringing just more information with respect to green jobs as well.
Okay, thank you very much. So we will continue on this, but we will continue getting to more questions as we go. So keep putting those in the Q&A. So thank you, everyone. And so now I'm going to introduce the Department of State Secretary Robert Rodriguez and to discuss details for the other four main funding categories.
Great, thank you, Andrea. I appreciate that. But before we get in there, I just wanted to, of course, thank Commissioner Sagos and Governor Hochul and really proud to represent the Department of State as we hear specifically about input from the communities that the Bond Act is going to serve. So just a little bit about the Department of State. We've recognized the growing threat of flooding and other extreme weather events and have committed to helping communities become more resilient through all of our programs. Through our work helping communities that were impacted by Sandy, Irene, and Lee, we help to develop risk assessment tools and risk maps that can help any community identify flood risk and prioritize activities to help bolster resiliency. So those are some of the things that we've done. We also have a program that's called the Local Waterfront Revitalization Program, or LWRP. And that helps communities to plan for extreme flooding and grow and develop in a way that lessens the risk while balancing their economic development, water quality, ecosystem protection and restoration, climate resiliency, and public health needs. So this program also helps to support the development of watershed management plans, which promote natural approaches to stormwater management, climate resiliency, water quality protection. So it's through this LWRP that we can provide the resources to help communities take steps to implement these plans. But what we realize is that there is so much more to do than our program can pay for. And that's why the Bond Act is so important, to allow us to scale up to help more communities. In addition to our LWRP, we also have the county-wide resiliency planning program. And this is within our Smart Growth Office. And these multi-municipal plans identify projects and strategies for communities to address climate resiliency, flood risk reduction, and green infrastructure. So it's through these smart growth planning and zoning grants that we help communities provide a blueprint so that they can grow and prosper in a way that promotes climate resiliency, energy efficiency, and clean energy infrastructure. So in short, the Department of State helps communities prepare to become more resilient, to have in place a pipeline of projects that may be implemented with resources from this Bond Act. So as you learn more about the Bond Act this evening, I encourage you to think about what you can do in your own community now to help identify risk and prepare to address it in a comprehensive way. So in other words, create your own local roadmap to resiliency that can be implemented with Bond Act money and can take advantage of other state programs, including our LWRP and others. So with that, let's dive into the details of the Bond Act and review the categories of projects that may be qualified. So onto the next slide, looking at climate change mitigation. So New York is on a path to achieve a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from 1990 levels by 2030 and an 85% reduction by 2050. So this requirement was established by the Climate Act, and it's an ambitious schedule because the magnitude of the climate crisis demands urgent action. That's why the Bond Act authorizes $1.5 billion to mitigate climate pollution and help communities adapt to climate change. And the Bond Act breaks the $1.5 billion into the following categories. So not less than $500 million of it will go towards zero emission school buses and infrastructure. No less than $400 million is for green building projects to increase energy efficiency or site renewables at state-owned buildings and public schools. No less than $200 million will go for projects to reduce or eliminate air and water pollution in disadvantaged communities. No less than $100 million will go to support climate adaptation and mitigation projects. And $300 million will go for other projects to combat climate change, which include urban forestry, urban heat projects such as green roofs, community gardens, cool pavement projects, and reflective roofs where green roofs are not possible, and projects that utilize natural and working lands to sequester carbon and mitigate methane emissions. So let's move on to the next slide and look at examples. As the commissioner mentioned, these are broad strokes. So we want to give you a sense of how those investments could look. And here are some of the past examples of projects that have successfully leveraged state and partner resources. So the Bond Act will look to fund investments in projects like these and many others to build on our past successes and sustain New York's continued progress across the state. So in 2022, the Evans Brant Lakeshore School District began deploying zero-emission school buses, which we know improve air quality and protect students from harmful diesel emissions. McKinley High School in Buffalo underwent a comprehensive reconstruction that incorporated numerous sustainability features, including this solar array. And also in August of 2022, an organization called Volunteers Improving Neighborhood Environments, Inc., also known as VINES, received a $100,000 environmental justice community impact grant from DEC to build community and home gardens to help support their focus on improving food access for immigrants and refugees in the Binghamton area. VINES empowers people to improve their lives and communities through local affordable food, from urban gardening and connecting urban consumers to rural farmers. On to the next category in the next slide, restoration and flood risk. Communities statewide are no strangers to flooding, and the risks are only growing as we see more extreme weather increasingly becoming the norm. So whether it's wave action from rising water levels along the Great Lakes, or debilitating snowstorms, or inland flooding in the Catskills, and many other communities, the financial costs of damage to property and infrastructure are staggering, and the risk to public safety is too high. So over the past decade, the Office of Resilient Homes and Communities, known as RHC, has managed the long-term recoveries from Hurricane Irene, Tropical Storm Lee, and Superstorm Sandy to provide more than $4.2 billion in federal funds to communities to meet their housing, economic development, community reconstruction, and infrastructure needs. The state also committed up to $300 million to benefit communities and improve resiliency in flood-prone regions along Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River after devastating floods in 2017 and again in 2019. So these were managed by both DEC and DOS, and these projects are bringing new life to waterfront communities that have experienced the hardship of recent flooding. So these disasters reveal the increased flood risks that we face as a result of climate change, and our response has included many flood risk reduction and restoration projects across the state. So one example, RHC managed a buyouts program that successfully returned 615 storm damaged properties to nature, allowing them to serve as a coastal buffer that will protect surrounding communities in perpetuity. The state is also taking proactive steps to understand and reduce the risk of future flood damage. For example, Department of State has helped numerous communities throughout the state to become more resilient by restoring tidal wetlands, right-sizing critical culverts, and reconnecting floodplains. So let's talk a little bit about the Bond Act funding and what exactly this $1.1 billion will do to protect communities from flood risks in a variety of ways. So specifically, not more than $250 million will go towards voluntary private property buyouts. No less than $100 million will go to support coastal rehabilitation and shoreline restoration. No less than $100 million will go towards local waterfront revitalization projects and projects which address inland flooding. And $650 million will go for other projects, including flood risk reduction projects such as moving, lifting, or raising flood-prone infrastructure or structures, relocation, repair, or raising flood-prone roads, removal, alteration, or right-sizing dams, bridges, and culverts. So restoration projects could also be such as floodplain, wetland, and stream restoration are included, forest conservation, endangered and threatened species projects, or land acquisition. That's a broad category for that $650 million. So let's move on to the next slide and give you some examples of how past investments, particularly in the areas of flooding, have helped address similar challenges and could potentially be used in the Bond Act funding. So the Patchogue Living Shore Project. So one of these, this project is one of the largest living shoreline restorations in New York, one of our biggest projects. This project is replacing deteriorating bulkheads with a soft shoreline and treatments and a series of rock sills behind which low and high marsh will be established to mitigate risk to the upland infrastructure. Now, this is a multifaceted project. It also includes bioswales designed to pre-treat stormwater from adjacent roads and the village's shorefront park, as well as reestablishing the connection of Little Creek to Patchogue Bay. So a lot of things happening in that project. Another project is the Whitestown Floodplain Restoration Project. It's a multi-phase green infrastructure resiliency project that was completed in 2022. It restored 9,000 linear feet of the Sauquet Creek to help mitigate flooding in a potential environmental justice area in Oneida County. So additional components of the project include climate smart communities grant to construct 2 of 3 floodplain benches to reduce flood stage during extreme weather events and to reduce the impacts of flooding to town and village properties, and to restore the natural riverline processes by connecting the Sauquet Creek to original floodplain. And lastly, in this slide, Gaylord Stream crossing in Owego. The Office of Resilient Homes and Communities worked with Owego to replace the existing undersized culvert that was beneath the Gaylord Road with a cost-effective open bottom structure designed to increase hydraulic capacity, reduce flood and erosion risk, and enable aquatic organism passage and improve road user safety. So the residents and the property owners along Gaylord Road will benefit from having a sustainable culvert to channel those floodwaters from disrupting traffic utilizing the road, and to provide potential flood reduction for high-risk flood areas to support community resiliency to future storms and flooding. So these are a few of the ways that collaborative partnerships and multiple funding sources can be combined to achieve resiliency goals. So let's move to our next funding category that details open space preservation and the benefits that come with that. So open space, New York State has long been a leader in preserving and protecting our open spaces and providing quality recreational experience for residents and visitors. Shout out to the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. They operate more than 250 parks, historic sites, recreational trails, golf courses, boat launches that encompass all 350,000 acres of mostly natural land and water, over 300 miles of shoreline, and their properties receive almost 80 million visitors a year. And DEC, they manage 5 million acres of public lands, 55 campgrounds and day use areas, and more than 5,000 miles of formal trails, and hundreds of trailheads, boat launches, and fishing sites, fish hatcheries, environmental education centers, and other facilities. Now, the Department of State, we provide support to communities to protect and improve their municipal open space, ensuring public access to waterfront parks, fishing docks, kayak launches, and trails. So there's three parts of that team. Now, climate change has and will continue to impact natural and cultural resources, including the health and safety of visitors and state operations and infrastructure. So the Bond Act is very important to help us to continue to expand and enhance these publicly owned resources and allow New Yorkers to connect with these historically underserved, disadvantaged communities and get better access to the waterways and to this open space. So the Bond Act specifically will help us do a couple of things. So some of those pots are no less than $300 million will go for open space land conservation projects. No less than $150 million will go towards farmland protections and easements. No more than $75 million will go towards fish hatcheries, and $125 million will go to other projects, including recreational infrastructure projects, including build out of state and municipal parks, fish hatcheries, campgrounds, and other amenities. Let's move to the next slide and go over some examples of what these investments could look like. So one investment is Rochester's Genesee Gateway Park and Riverway Trail. Now, this was a city, state, and private partnership. The city of Rochester is revitalizing the Genesee River corridor to bring residents to the waterfront and connect neighborhoods. So recently completed was a $6.8 million revitalization of the Genesee Gateway Park and the Riverway Trail, which received support from our local waterfront revitalization program, Rock the Riverway, the American Rescue Plan, as well as other sources, and is located in the South Wedge neighborhood between the city's business core and the University of Rochester. And the improvements there include the installation of beautiful public art that connects the park to the surrounding heritage, as well as upgrades such as new walkways, enhanced landscaping, new signage, a playground, a basketball court, bike racks, repair stations, and a canoe and kayak launch. Another example is the Green Lake State Park waterfront makeover. So they recently received $6 million in a renovation of the Central New York's most visited state park, including converting a deteriorated boathouse that was from the 1940s into a modern 1,100 square foot facility with indoor classrooms and multipurpose space and restrooms, as well as an outdoor classroom, lakefront boardwalk, and canoe and kayak landing. So the project also helped to improve the ecosystem of the park, including restoring the lake edge, redirecting stormwater to bioretention basins, and rehabilitating a deteriorating parking area with green elements. So this is an element of the project that was included from EFC's Green Innovation Grant Program. So leveraging additional dollars in addition to the state dollars. And then the last project is improvements to fish hatcheries. In recent years, DEC worked to improve several of the 12 fish hatcheries that it owns across the state. And this annually stocks millions of catchable sized brook, brown, and rainbow trout into more than 1,200 waterways. So with the designated Bond Act funding, we can do even more to help New Yorkers fishing, stay connected to nature, and contribute to their local economies. So these are just a few of the ways that the state investments are helping to protect open space, enhance habitats, and to create recreational opportunities for New Yorkers and visitors. So on to our next slide. So water quality is the fourth area. I'm proud to serve on the board of EFC, and EFC is New York State's water infrastructure bank. It's funded some of the largest infrastructure projects in the state of New York. They have managed our state revolving funds, and I think they've done over $44 billion in financial assistance to communities for critical water infrastructure since 1990. So the state's going to build on this infrastructure from the EFC and this foundation to even more effectively support reliable and effective water infrastructure, which is critical for the health of our communities and the protection of all of our natural resources. So the Bond Act focuses $650 million to help ensure that New Yorkers have safe drinking water and clean, resilient environments. So this funding specifically will go to support investments to upgrade crucial wastewater infrastructure and to replace failing septic systems. It'll also fund critical water infrastructure across the state, including enhanced treatment systems to safeguard against harmful emerging contaminants and leverage federal funding to replace lead service lines. So specifically, the law requires that we spend no less than $250 million to support municipal stormwater grants. We spend no less than $200 million for water infrastructure improvement projects. And we spend no less than $200 million to support other programs, which include green infrastructure, an approach to water management that protects, restores, or mimics the natural water cycle, projects to reduce agricultural nutrient runoff and promote soil health, and projects to reduce the frequency of harmful algal blooms. HABs, HABs, they happen when nutrients and other contaminants affect water quality and pose a threat to public health or recreational use of water bodies. And ultimately, projects to protect drinking water by replacing lead service lines. I want to say that twice because we know that is an ongoing concern for many municipalities. And moving on to the next slide, which focuses on examples of how we've been able to invest in improving water quality, to give you a sense of how those investments could look in New York communities. So first is the village of Waverly in Tioga County. They upgraded its wastewater treatment plant in 2019 with a new treatment process to reduce nutrient pollution and improve water quality in Cayuga Creek. The town of Watson in Lewis County completed a water district extension in September 2021 to serve safe public water to 330 residential parcels that were previously using private contaminated wells. And the work included the installation of 53,000 linear feet of new water main and a new 180,000 gallon storage tank and 2 new production wells. So, and the last project on the slide is the Nature Conservancy, the Finger Lakes Land Trust, and the Peconic Land Trust. Those are among the many organizations in the state that have received funding through the Water Quality Improvement project program to protect drinking water sources. So by acquiring lands in the watersheds of Skaneateles Lake and Owasco Lake, the efforts have helped to reduce sediment as well as nutrient loads that can contribute to the harmful algal blooms. So with that, we'll take a moment and pause for questions and allow the participants to engage.
Okay, thank you. So we do have quite a few questions coming in, and I'll go through a few of them now, but we will save more to the end of the presentation. So just keep that in mind. So I did have a question from the beginning, and it was a question related to the recent canceling of school activities due to high heat days and poor air quality days. And the question was asking about if the Bond Act can the Bond Act fund projects to address the significant impact that climate change has had on our air quality and heat indexes in New York. So I didn't know if this was perchance a Jim Tierney question or Patrick Foster question. Jim, you are muted. Oh, there we go.
Can you hear me now? Nope.
Yes.
Oh, I think Patrick Foster is on point for climate change and air questions. Patrick.
Hi, Andrea. Can you reread the question real quick?
Yes, sorry about that. It was referencing the recent school outdoor activities being canceled for high heat and air quality conditions, and just asking if Bond Act could fund projects to address these significant impacts that climate changes has had on our air quality and heat indexes in New York.
Sure. So I think we maybe answered that already in the question and answer section, but there will definitely be funding that's going both towards green buildings, which will be funneled in part to our public schools, as well as funding that will be directed towards school buses under the Bond Act. Some of that funding for the green buildings portion of the Bond Act will definitely be focused on interior systems. So there should also be some improvements to indoor air quality as well, which I believe is reflected in the question and answer section.
Okay, thank you. So then we had another question. Oh, sorry, that question was from Kathleen Jenny, not quite sure. The next question was from Peter Bauer, and this was related to the Bond Act purchasing land in the state of New York, mentioning that the previous Bond Act that the state had purchased thousands of acres, and asking how the state was going to get back into the position with staffing and streamlined land acquisition process to begin purchasing large tracts of land again under this new Bond Act. And that was a question for Katie Petronas.
Sure. Hi, Andrea. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So I would say there are a couple of things we're doing. First, we are in the process of updating and revising our open space plan, which will guide that acquisition. So we are very close to being able to establish regional advisory committees. Those committees will meet and identify priorities statewide for conservation in New York. Those priorities will shape the future conservation work that we can achieve through the Bond Act. And as to the question, and I'll just say it's contemplating all of the things that we're setting as priorities right now. So it will, I imagine, contemplate the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act goals, for example, and our really important resiliency goals. And I imagine that the regional advisory committees will be looking at all of those statewide objectives as they identify the conservation goals for New York State moving forward. And then to the question about sort of how are we going to achieve specific conservation outcomes, we are in the process of looking at the best way to streamline our acquisition process. We are also, based on the most recently adopted budget, going to be increasing our staffing in a number of our divisions, including those that are working on land conservation, so that they'll be better able to meet the Bond Act goals and the conservation targets. So that is, I think, one other thing that we're working on right now. We're also looking at a different set of programs. So we're looking at whether we need to create new programs to help us achieve some of those goals. So we're looking at sort of traditional land conservation achieved primarily through the 3 agencies that were identified in the implementing legislation language, Ag and Markets, DEC, and the Office of Parks and Recreation. And we're also looking at ways that we can expand programming to bring in our partners, because we know that this is going to be a large effort and is going to require work with our partners. So we're looking at programs that can assist municipalities in additional conservation efforts. We're looking at programs that can assist nonprofit organizations in achieving additional efforts. And we're really, I think, taking a holistic approach to the best way to spend down those dollars to take advantage of those goals. Oh, Andrew, there you go.
Oh, sorry. We did have another couple of questions that were kind of directed towards you, Katie, as well. So there was one related to agroforestry and asking if there was maybe room to implement agroforestry projects with the funding, and if so, what categories would fit best. There was another one asking about could projects include carbon sequestration forestry projects related to recreation or things like that. And I know we did talk about one question was about trails, but noting that although we do really want to focus on trails and do work on that, we know that that's important. The Bond Act projects actually have to be bondable, so have to last for at least 10 years. And some of that's a little hard with trail projects. But anyways, I'll turn that over to you, Katie.
Sure. So to the agroforestry question, I would say, like I just kind of answered the last question with, we are looking at programs right now that can help support all of our conservation goals, including working forest conservation support and things like community forest programs. So, you know, we already have an existing community forest grants program. We're looking at whether or not that can be a model for expansion. We're also considering other programs that might support agroforestry in New York. Certainly, forestation in general supports our CLCPA goals and our sequestration goals. And so we're looking at the best ways to do that beyond our traditional land acquisition conservation mechanism. So I'll say all of that is in the planning stage right now, but it's certainly something that we are thinking about and thinking about the best ways to prioritize. And I would encourage whoever asked that question to please, when we share information about the project ideas link, you know, that might be a good place to share thoughts on that as well.
Okay, and I'll throw one more question out there so that we can continue with the presentation. And that we had a water question that I'll turn over to Jim Tierney, and it was asking about how much of the money would go towards lead service line replacement projects.
It's a very important area. It's not been determined yet. As you know, that there's some $15 billion nationally in the bipartisan infrastructure law in order to address lead service lines. But the exact cut of how much money from the water quality project would go toward an additional share of funds to lead service line remediation hasn't been decided yet. But the Environmental Facilities Corporation has a very active program and is running grant programs throughout the state as an aspect of its Water Infrastructure Improvement Act program, its intended use plan, and how it inserts bipartisan infrastructure law into the grants that are sought through those programs. Thanks.
Okay, I see one more question in the chat that I'm just going to read out. This was for Patrick Foster. This was a question asking, will individuals, for-profit organizations, and or nonprofits be able to pursue Bond Act funding?
Good question. So the quick answer is nonprofits, yes, and other private entities, for-profit entities, and individuals, no. Under New York State finance law, we would not be able to fund directly through the Bond Act for-profit entities or individuals. But the Bond Act itself does specifically call out nonprofits in some of the categories for funding. each of the different pots of funding will have different eligibility criteria. And once those come out, you'll be able to see sort of where it's contemplated that each funding stream goes towards. We do think that private entities will eventually benefit from a lot of the Bond Act funding all throughout the state. And there'll definitely be partnerships in between private entities and nonprofit and state entities that we'll be looking at. Thanks for the question.
Okay, thank you. So we will continue on with the presentation. I'm going to turn this over to Susanna Randall to read the next few slides. So Susanna, it is all up to you.
All right, thank you very much. So I want to make sure that folks are aware that the first Bond Act water quality funding opportunity is available now. During Earth Week, Governor Hochul announced $425 million in state grants that would be available for critical water infrastructure projects to protect public health and the environment. And we just heard from Jim Tierney a second ago about and resilient infrastructure spending. Of the $425 million currently available, $200 million is being made available with the first investments under the Bond Act, which I think is pretty exciting, right? This infusion of funding will continue to strengthen resiliency, combat climate change, create jobs in the manufacturing, engineering, construction, plant operation, and related industry sectors, and help make water infrastructure investments more affordable for local governments. EFC has awarded more than $2 billion in state water grants since 2015, saving recipients more than $4.6 billion in potential financing costs. So consistent with the process for other funding categories, draft eligibility criteria guidelines were released in March for a 30-day public review and comment period before this funding was made available. And the application period is open until July 28th, 2023. And that's at efc.ny.gov, and that's on your screen. And I think these slides are available later. There's a nice little QR code to make it easy to get to that funding site to drill down into that. And as Jim mentioned, the lead lines and looking at funding for those critical infrastructure projects. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So the Bond Act comes at a time of really unprecedented state and federal investments to address climate change, to address infrastructure needs. This $4.2 billion accompanies significant wins in the 2023-2024 enacted budget, where Governor Hochul included a record $400 million for the state's Environmental Protection Fund. This fund is an example of funding source that will complement or be leveraged to enhance the Bond Act funds to achieve beneficial environmental impacts across the state. The budget also includes $500 million in clean water funding, bringing New York's total clean water infrastructure investment to $5 billion since 2017. Water quality funding, EPF grants, and many other state funding opportunities are made available on an ongoing basis. So I want to highlight that. We have experts, as you've heard from online tonight, but also at upcoming sessions will be in person to be able to talk with you to explore sources of funding for the projects that you have in mind. And I want to make a plug for, I know we're going to come to it at the end, filling out these project forms to really help us get a flavor of the types of projects and the types of questions and needs that are out there so that we can respond to them. Biden administration and much of New York's congressional delegation also made incredible investments in our state and country's future with the enactment of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or EJA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and CHIPS and Science Act, or CHIPS. The recent federal action with these landmark investments is providing New York with tremendous national progress on the climate crisis and offers a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, really, to capitalize on these funds to supplement state and private investment that have the state and private investments that have already been committed to build the green future here in New York. EJA, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or bill, the CHIPS Act and the IRA are providing unprecedented funding to reduce consumer energy costs, slash carbon emissions and pollution, ensure energy security and resilience, increase energy innovation and domestic manufacturing, and advance environmental justice. New York will be seeing billions of dollars through these and other federal commitments to repair and replace aging infrastructure, address climate change, and advance environmental justice. And go ahead and go to the next slide, please. We really want to make sure that attendees know that you may not need to wait as we, until after we start rolling out more Bond Act programs to access state resources for your projects right now. The consolidated funding application process is live and soliciting projects. There is up to $150 million available through over 30 state programs. Programs like the Water Quality Improvement Project Program, the Environmental Protection Fund Grant Program for Parks, Preservation, and Heritage, Carbon Neutral Community Economic Development, the Commercial and Industrial Carbon Challenge, the Green Innovation Grant Program, Climate Smart Community Grants, non-ag and non-point source planning and MS4 mapping grants, Wastewater Infrastructure and Engineering Planning Grant Program, the Regional Trails Program, Recharge New York, and the Local Waterfront Revitalization Program. And I know you've heard a little bit about some of these as we've gone through the presentation tonight. In addition, there is an active grant solicitation that I want to call your attention to for 2 environmental justice programs that total more than $8 million to help build stronger community organizations and directly help improve air quality in disadvantaged communities. And I know we had a question that touched on that a little bit earlier. New funding opportunities for municipalities and advocacy organizations are announced regularly. So I would encourage you strongly to sign up for updates from those. Go ahead and go to the next slide, if you would, please. So let's talk about next steps for tonight and for the longer term. So to reach where we are now, Governor Hochul convened an interagency working group after the Bond Act passed to begin identifying needs for environmental funding across the state. The group is working to solidify the program logistics, including how projects will be selected, how funds will be delivered, and developing measures to really make this a transparent and collaborative process. When complete, we will be releasing for public comment the eligibility guidelines referenced earlier, as we did with the recently issued eligibility guidelines to implement the water quality funding available right now from EFC. We remain committed to this type of funding transparency throughout the Bond Act implementation. Go ahead, yep. As Commissioner Sagos noted earlier, this is the 3rd of 10 listening sessions, 8 of them in person, 2 virtual. Our next in-person session is going to be in the North Country at the North Country Community College in Saranac Lake on July 14th. And there are other sessions to follow throughout July and August. At the in-person events, we will have informational tables set up where we can, folks can speak directly with experts from each of the programs to discuss the presentation, to discuss questions, to discuss potential projects. And I'll put a plug in to make sure we get those captured either through the online survey tool or tools that we'll have available at the site for each of those in-person events. Representatives from EFC, NYSERDA, DEC, Parks, RHC, Ag and Markets, and other state partners will be there on site to help answer questions and respond. To see the full schedule, you can go online to ny.gov/Bond Act, and you can register there and see the schedule there. We'll also be gathering feedback, as I noted just before, about the types of projects. So the project survey idea that I mentioned, there's this online tool. Please, please, please enter what you have about a project, share ideas or information that you might have. It's not an application. It's not a request for proposals, but it's really a way to have us learn about the universe of projects that local governments, community organizations, and the public may be envisioning for Bond Act funds. It really helps inform us as to the demand and the needs that folks are seeing and feeling. The link is in the chat, and we will be sending, we'll also be sending this out to participants after this meeting. Once you're on the survey page, you can enter as much or as little detail as you want about a potential project. If you have a specific project in mind, you can locate it on the map. And that has a data layer that shows the location of the disadvantaged communities. So you're able to see in real time. I know we had a question earlier about zip codes and location, and this might be a really helpful tool for you to be able to see, here's my project location. How does that align with or coincide with a disadvantaged community map? The survey also includes optional fields about the project stage, timeline, potential Bond Act funding categories, and project contacts. So we really encourage you to go to the site and fill this out because we want to hear more about your general ideas for funding and your challenges that you may have had in the past with regard to accessing state funds. The surveys is one way, and we'll continue to, that we will, excuse me, the survey is one way that we're going to continue to involve stakeholders and New Yorkers as the Bond Act continues to roll out across communities. So I'll turn it back over to you, to Andrea. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So just a reminder, we do have two options for communicating, but we would like you to use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen to type in your questions so that we can get to those. And I also want to point out that we will send an email with some follow-up details to everyone who registered to this after the meeting. So I know a few people had some issues trying to get connected. So if you didn't register, we're sent a link to join. If you could please put your email address in the Q&A and we'll keep track of that so that we make sure to add you to any follow-up emails that go out after this. So thank you for that. So we will now go through a few more questions. We do have quite a few that have come in, so we will try to get to as many as we can. And some of these are some more complicated questions that do have a lot more, require some more details. So we are keeping track of all the questions that come in. If we can't answer it today, we will make sure it goes in the FAQ that will get posted to the Bond Act website. So just keep that in mind. So I have a couple questions related to water quality and flood mitigation that are for Jim Tierney. So the first one is asking, can funding be used for municipalities to update zoning laws to disallow new construction near riparian zones? And it's also asking about updating floodplain maps to reflect the new flood risks.
Thanks for your question. It's a great topic. Unfortunately, the Bond Act money is for capital projects. Think of something that exists for 10 years or longer, something structural, something you can point to and bond to. Encourage smart growth planning. You know, as the Secretary of State mentioned, and does a lot of planning, a lot of information along those lines to help communities grow smarter. But that's not a topic for expenditures of the Bond Act. It's not so much for planning, it's your actual project implementation. Thank you.
Okay, and another question for you, Jim. So will water infrastructure improvement funding be directed towards emerging contaminants? Will that include wastewater treatment or only drinking water treatment?
If it's a municipality and there's an issue with a concentrated source of emerging contaminants like perfluorinated compounds, yes, that would be eligible. Already we are expending through the Clean Water Infrastructure Act hundreds of millions of dollars to add treatment systems onto drinking water systems to reduce perfluorinated compounds in drinking water supplies all around the state. Those programs are run by the State Department of Health and the Environmental Facilities Corporation. It's a very serious issue. We don't know yet whether we will have to look at wastewater treatment plants as for treatment options, but it's something that's being developed and looked at very carefully. Thank you.
Thank you. So the next question is related to disadvantaged communities. So I'll turn this over to Alana or someone else from the Environmental Justice Office. Will our local community leaders be required to host community conversations relative to proposed projects in Rochester's disadvantaged communities?
So just to be clear, the disadvantaged communities criteria is, it affects state government entities. So we cannot require local governments to adhere to disadvantaged communities criteria, but we can absolutely encourage them. And we're definitely willing to have those conversations. And we also encourage community members to have those conversations and to even set up community-based conversations and invite their local municipal officials to these meetings. But with regards to that, no, the disadvantaged communities criteria is primarily for state governments, and it is not something that local governments have to adhere to.
Okay, thank you. So we had a couple questions come in about the length of time the money will be available. So there was one asking, saying that federal funds have a 4 or 5 year deadline for spending. Would something like that apply to New York State spending if it was matched with federal dollars, or is there any timelines for spending this New York State money? That is a general question, and I don't know if I could turn that over to someone exec.
Andrea, I'd be happy to answer that question.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
The questioner knows that it's a good point. The federal money under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and increased levels of federal funding, just baseline, that were done in the past few years, is proposed to be expended over the course of 5 or 6 years. Sometimes, of course, those have a tail where there's an allocation to a particular project, but it might take a number of years to get the project fully designed and implemented. That's likely going to be the same thing with the Bond Act. We've been looking at it generally as something, though not firmly or rigidly, as something that would likely be rolled out and implemented over the course of approximately a 5-year period. And realizing that some projects, particularly significant projects in a municipality, may take a bit longer to fully design, implement, and bid and roll out. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so continuing on, we had actually another question for you, Jim, about water quality, asking if refurbishment of existing water systems, such as large storage tanks, would qualify under the water quality improvement and resilient infrastructure projects. Would replacement be required?
Well, if there's basically anything that goes into drinking water or wastewater treatment or reclamation is something that's fundable. We currently have these very large-scale programs run through the Environmental Facilities Corporation, as the Secretary of State mentioned, $425 million in grants just from EFC, just in state funds, just in 1 year. It's an astounding level of grants relative to the rest of the country. It might be as much as the rest of the country gives in water grants combined at this point in other states. Those funds are available now, as is another program called the Water Quality Improvement Project Program from New York State DEC, which generally runs somewhere north of $100 million year in and year out in water infrastructure grants. And then on top of it, our friends in the agriculture and markets also runs a very good program called Agricultural Non-Point Management Programs, basically to help farmers reduce nutrient pollution and also increase soil health throughout the state. So all combined, this can be somewhere in north of $600–800 million in state funds alone. And of course, what we are striving to do is bring in as much federal funds as we can to match with the state funds to help our hard-pressed municipalities out. So yes, anything associated with drinking water or wastewater hard infrastructure, it's clearly something that could be eligible for grant funding from the state of New York. Thank you.
Okay. So I have another question. This is to Ron Roush. And it's a question talking about a specific lake in the Southern Adirondacks, and noted that there are a number of residents who are concerned about shore erosion, and that the shore has eroded 18 inches over the last 10 or so years. And it may be due to boat traffic, but they were asking, how would the community, the residents of that lake, get involved in potentially Bond Act funding to address the shore erosion problem?
Thanks. Quite likely through the establishment. I don't know if you have a lake owner, homeowners association or something along those lines. If boat traffic is the main cause, you might want to look at local regulations and enforcement of those regulations. But there are clearly there's technical assistance at DEC and parks and other places to help with some softer shoreline solutions that can be done instead of just the typical hard armor.
Okay, and while you're on the line, I did have another question related to you. So this was talking about the Erie Cattaraugus Rail Trail. And hold on, just the length that this goes, it was talking about a lot of these, the trails and the leases that are part of this trail are in need of quiet economic development, recreational opportunities, and culvert restoration. Asking if this would qualify under recreational infrastructure and where they would go from here to try to get involved with that.
If you have some specific needs on a project basis, which it sounds like, I would highly encourage you and recommend that you fill out the survey, talk about in the portal, talk about what specific needs you have and how they can be addressed. I mean, certainly the Bond Act has a lot of cross-cutting, covers a lot of ground in different areas. That's where we work with our partners and other agencies. You know, is there a culvert component? Is it a new trail section? And then we take off different pieces to try to complete the entire project as we're talking amongst ourselves, Albany. But I would highly encourage you to submit it to the portal. That's how we get a good idea of everything that's out there in the world of potential projects.
Okay, thank you. So I have, well, one thing I wanted to note, Madeline did put in the chat that I guess there is a lot of storms and lightning right now, and some people may have some connectivity issues, but we are recording this and we will make this available afterward if you do miss anything. So there's another question here for Jim Tierney. Will the Bond Act provide funding for voluntary buyout programs, such as the one that New York City is planning to create?
Yes, at least $250 million would be available for voluntary buyout programs. You have made it notice that the prior, it was previously known as the Governor's Office of Storm Recovery, now known as the Office of Resilient Homes and Communities, operated a terrific flood buyout program post-Superstorm Sandy. It's likely that the Resilient Homes and Communities will play a major role in trying to keep that going. What we're also noticing is that there's a number of potential avenues for flood buyout funding from various federal agencies, in particular, FEMA, HUD, and the Natural Resources Conservation Services. And we're already looking to tie into those funds to leverage federal funds with state funds to make those voluntary buyouts and hopefully restoration on the property acquired through voluntary buyouts a reality here. Thank you.
Okay, and I see that there was a follow-up question asking about why trail projects may not be bondable. And I think, Katie, you had a little more information on what is bondable and how that might apply to trails.
Sure. I don't have a lot. We've actually covered a decent amount of it. I think Jim Tierney actually referenced in one of his previous responses that the Bond Act eligible dollars are intended to be capital projects, projects that have a 10-year lifespan or greater. And so, for the most part, that means that it for a trail project to be bondable, it has to be, a project that can be identified as having greater than a 10-year lifespan, things like hardened surface trails, projects like that. So large scale rail trail type projects, smaller sort of hiking trails historically have not been recipients of Bond Act dollars. And it would be, I think, challenging for them to cross that threshold. So I think, we're not able to spend Bond Act dollars on every type of project. Of course, we've mentioned in other responses that these dollars will support other spending. And so they will support our maintenance work, our stewardship work throughout the state. But when we're looking at the way that the Bond Act dollars themselves can be spent, when we talk about trails and recreational infrastructure, well, specifically trails within recreational infrastructure, we really are thinking about those that have a qualified 10-year or greater lifespan. And historically, those have been things like hardened surface trails.
Okay, thank you.
And Andrea, I would just ask before we leave that if Ron Roush has any follow-up thoughts or if anybody else on the call.
No, just to add that certainly the spectrum of trails has evolved greatly in the last couple of decades. You know, at one point trails were just seen as the ones I remember hiking on were pretty much goat paths in the Catskills and Adirondacks. Now we're talking about a whole spectrum of multi-use trails, ADA compliant trails. So there is a wide variety, and that's what we really need to nail down. So again, if you have questions, you have suggestions, please fill out the survey. That's how we're going to make our informed decisions going forward before we prepare something for the guidelines for public comment. Thanks.
So the next question here would go to Alana or someone else in the EJ office, asking what are examples of the kinds of projects that might fall under the scope of community impact grants?
So community impact grants are sort of a general grant that has a history in the Office of Environmental Justice. It is our mainstay grant, and we used this as a model for bondable grants. And so it covers a lot more. It has and Patrick can jump in and add to this, but it allows for a broad range of grants that would directly address environmental issues and mitigation within disadvantaged communities. Patrick, did you want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah, there's a specific pot of money that is provided for in the climate change portion of the Bond Act for both air and water impacts to disadvantaged communities. So we're working now to put together the draft eligibility criteria for those grant opportunities. And using our experience with Alana's office, providing those grant opportunities to environmental justice and disadvantaged communities to shape and form those eligibility criteria. So there'll be more information coming out soon about those opportunities, but generally, yes, there's focused funding provided for in the Bond Act.
While I have you on, Patrick, there was a question that was asked about cleaning up. Could the money be used for cleaning up contaminated lands like old factories and things like that?
Yeah, I saw that. Interesting question. To my knowledge, the answer is no. There's not specific funding in the Bond Act for cleaning up contaminated lands. Of course, we do that here at DEC already through our state Superfund program. But the Bond Act, as far as I can see, does not have monies specifically for cleaning up contaminated lands. Yeah, that's all I'll say about that.
Okay, thank you. So here is a general question of asking about the timelines. Have timelines been established for submission of grants under the Bond Act? And this may be submission of applications. I think we kind of talked about that a bit, but it may be something that we need to still figure out. Didn't know if someone had a comment on that.
Andrea, I think I can help out on that. The thing that we're doing, again, this is in a short form, a listening tour, right? We have high-level people from state agencies, including cabinet members on this line, trying to learn from you all what the priorities are. And we're going around the state learning the priorities. And as a predicate to going out with broad-based grant programs, we want to hear from you. And that's part of this whole process. But before we also go out with any specific grant program, say a request for applications and the like, we are, particularly any competitive applications, we are likely to do a comment period where we release it as eligibility guidelines to the public, have the public comment on it, critique it, tell us what we're missing, and then improve it based on public comment. And then and only then would we go out for a grant program. The general schedule that we're thinking of is more in the early fall, hopefully, to start getting these eligibility guidelines out to you all for public comment, with hopefully fairly rapid and timely follow-up thereafter, where we get the grant applications, and grant programs out to communities to begin applying and getting money out the door. Thanks.
I muted. Another question for you, Jim, was related to would design of capital projects be eligible if we don't think that we could complete construction within the project performance period?
Once there's been an award to a particular project, the design would be included in that award. Say if somebody wants to upgrade a wastewater treatment plant or a drinking water facility, and they receive a grant of $5–10 million to do that, yes, that design is involved. But that's a little bit different, and there's important nuance for people to understand. There's a little bit difference when it comes to preparing an initial project report that is usually about 90% of any application for grant funding. So if you're putting together a project proposal, putting together basically an application for large funding, two key places to go for that. One is the Environmental Facilities Corporation's Engineering Planning Grant Program. It's on their website. It's out for use right now. You can go to the combined funding application, municipalities out there, and see it. And that's for any and all forms of wastewater, water quality, water reclamation projects. DEC does that, has also put together something called its non-point planning grant program, which basically gives grants of 90% grants of $30, $50, $100,000 to municipalities in order to formulate a project. And so what we hope to do is get that project formulated as the basis for an application of the big funding. So get $50,000 from DEC, prepare the application for any sort of resiliency, flood resiliency, natural restoration, non-point pollution program, stormwater project, and the like. Same thing from the Environmental Facilities Corporation. And then use that to apply for the big bucks. And once you have that engineering report put together, think of it as 10% design, basic cost, basic alternatives analysis. That's really the keys to the vault for where you can get funding from DEC, from the Environmental Facilities Corporation, and use it to apply for federal funds. So I really encourage people to take a look at the Engineering Planning Grant Program and the Non-Point Planning Grant Program as ways of getting the project pipeline going for the Bond Act and for other grant programs that are out there. Thank you.
Thank you. So here's a question for Patrick. Could a for-profit organization partner with a nonprofit to meet eligibility requirements?
Hi, again. Yeah, so I also put an answer to this in written form, but we think that the Bond Act funding that's going to be going out into the world is going to have this sort of knock-on effect throughout the economy. So there's going to be impacts to all sorts of entities from this funding throughout the state. We, again, can only fund nonprofit entities, but we do expect that there will be all sorts of partnerships with a diverse set of organizations throughout the state from Bond Act funding. We see that in grant programs that we run now and expect that to continue. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So I think we've gone through most of the questions I'm seeing here, and I know we are getting towards the end of our time, I believe. Are there any questions I have missed or anything else that anyone wanted to follow up on? Okay, I think we're sounding good. So I know that we did get some questions were responded to in the chat, and we have kept track of everything that was answered. And we will have an FAQ document up on the website and the recording of this available as well once we have that translated. So I just want to say thank you again, everyone, for coming tonight and for showing your support for the Bond Act and trying to make this as successful as possible. And we do look forward to your comments, your responses to the survey, and any other questions that you might have. And we do have a Bond Act email address. So if you have any more questions or things you want to follow up with us on, that email address is bondact@dec.ny.gov. And we do have additional meetings coming up, so feel free to attend the meeting in person. Or we do have one more virtual session coming up on July 26th. And we do look forward to all of your ideas, questions, your input, and everything. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us tonight, and have a great rest of your evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Right, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.